my ears then.
Okay, well, good afternoon from London, everyone. Thanks again for joining us, and hi to everyone that's on YouTube Live. And welcome again to the Zoomed In Festival, a new virtual festival of architectural photography. So it's great to have a fantastic panel here today, and this is part of a day that's been curated by myself. So I'm Luke O'Donovan, Festival Director for Zoomed In. But I also work as a photographer, and I've been starting to kind of branch out a bit into curation with a good friend and collaborator of mine, Francisco. So do you want to say hi, Francisco?
Hi, everyone. Yes, so I want to start by giving you, Luke, a big thanks. I think everybody agrees that you have done a fantastic job organizing this festival, and it has been a huge success so far. I'm Francisco Ibanez. I'm an architect and photographer. We have been curating this day with Luke around the theme of power structures. And we have a an excellent panel today discussing around the topic of public space, which is a hugely relevant topic always, and especially nowadays because of all the pandemic situation we're going through. So Eddie, I pass it on to you so you can introduce the amazing guests that we have today.
Well, I think actually, sorry, just before we go over to Eddie, so yeah, we're very lucky to be joined today by Edwin Heathcote, or Eddie. He's the editor of Reading Design and the architecture critic at Financial Times. He's going to be chairing this discussion. But yeah, I just wanted to say we're very close to 500 YouTube subscribers. So please do, if you're able to, share with friends, keep hitting those buttons. Feed in questions as well on the live. I'll be showing them to a panel. And we're getting closer and closer to 1,000 Instagram followers as well. We just passed 700 earlier this morning. So at Zoomed In Festival, please to keep up with everything we're doing. And we're on all day as well, aren't we, Francisco? So do you want to give us really quickly an overview of the other events we have today?
So we have today a presentation of Lorian, a very well-known architectural photographer. We're going to be reviewing some of his work, and afterwards we're going to have a brief discussion and Lorian is going to be answering some questions. And after that, we're going to have a quick presentation of 5 photographers that all work with use photography as a research tool. They work with projects that they have started themselves. We will be discussing around how you find a topic to work with, the own rules of your work, how you do work with that, and how do you plan to show your work after you finish a series of photography. And we're going to finish the day with the screening of a film about Robin Hood Gardens with the director of Urban Think Tank, Alfredo. We're going to screen that film. We're going to screen a brief clip of Torre David. So we're going to rescue that or revisit that film that was showed in the Venice Biennale in 2016. And then we're going to have a brief discussion with Alfredo about his work, and he will give us some insights about his multidisciplinary practice. So we're going to have a really exciting day.
Yeah, and this is all, that last event we confirmed this morning, this is all kind of a very, thrown together last minute, and it's kind of in response to myself and Francisco. We wanted to hold this physical exhibition, and we're joined by some other people doing very exciting things. We're looking forward to visiting, but we've had to kind of move into this digital space instead, which is very timely because of, we want to be part of the London Festival of Architecture, who, by the way, are doing a great digital program throughout June, so look out for that. But we've kind of moved this forward into the digital space. We're really interested to see kind of how you'll respond to that. But anyway, I've gone on enough, so over to Eddie, and I hope you enjoy your panel talk.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Francisco. As you know, the title of the debate today is Longing for Public Space, and it's intended to encapsulate the loss that we all feel, the need we have for spaces of commingling, communing, whether they're piazzas or parks or pubs or clubs, and we're mostly conditioned to be together. And here we are, apart, atomized, talking from our own private spaces about public space. As Luke said, we've got a great panel today. We've got the 2020 British Pavilion curators, Unscene Architecture, Madeleine, Kessler and Manijeh, Verghese. We've got Design Museum Chief Curator, Justin McGuirk, and we've got the photographers Cristobal, Palma, who's joining us from Santiago, and Will Scott. Okay, I think the obvious place to start today is this crisis that we're in, and how this current condition might allow us to appreciate public space in a different way. I mean, there's this kind of cliche about never letting a good crisis go to waste. And there's something in that. Like, what is it that we might be able to take away from this experience of atomization and the changes in the use of public space, whether it's increased pedestrian space, maybe it's taking away some of the cars from the cities, whether it's the way we interact, whether it's social distancing. Do you think that there's a possibility, any of you, that something positive might come out of this experience? No one's jumping in, so I'm going to go straight to either of Unscene and put them on the spot. What do you think? What might come out of this? Is there anything good?
Yeah, I think, I mean, every time there's some kind of crisis in the world, there's always also an opportunity to pause and reflect and think about what it is that sort of works in the city and what it is that doesn't, and that we can start to sort of prioritize and improve. And I think there's a huge opportunity going forward for people to sort of come together and realize the value of public space, and to really place a value on these spaces that we haven't necessarily sort of recognized in the past. So it's really interesting right now. There seems to be a lot of cities in the world who are sort of testing out whether roads can become sort of used more by cyclists and pedestrians, and having more of an emphasis on that, and which, in turn helps sort of in terms of climate and the way we use the city. And there sort of seems to be a real opportunity to sort of test these ideas that perhaps have been spoken about, but have sort of been sort of disregarded or left behind or not prioritized in the right way. And perhaps there's a real opportunity to start to prioritize these spaces. Equally, there's a lot of talk in the press right now about things like the pub and the high streets, and how important they are to our sort of the way we live and in our communities and our societies, how they function more than just a place to go shopping or to go drinking. Like, these are real community kind of hubs, and how do we make sure they survive this kind of situation? I think it's really important that we we make sure that this conversation is happening and that we don't lose these spaces. And it's about people sort of suddenly recognizing the importance of public space.
When architects and urbanists and planners and sociologists talk about public space, it seems to me that they tend to talk about this kind of Italian model, the piazza, the street, the kind of the connective tissue of the city. But actually, in a crisis like this, when you remove commerce, when you remove the possibility of buying and drinking and consuming in places, then we tend to find that it's other parts of the city that maybe we hadn't paid much attention to that tend to be highlighted. I think we were talking just briefly with Justin yesterday about how the common, it might be a superior form for a lockdown than a park. It hasn't got the formal constraints. And Justin, what do you think?
I mean, I think there are some advantages to the common for sure, and it was thrown into relief when my local park was closed. The park is, in a way, a quintessential public space. Public in that sense means run by a local council. Yeah. And it means it has a fence around it, which means it's easy to close. But the other thing that struck me when I started using my local common instead was that not only is there no fence around a common, because by definition you can't enclose it, but the space was more flexible and open to whatever use you wanted to bring to it. So it's basically a patch of grass, and traditionally residents would be allowed to or locals would be allowed to bring their sheep there to graze. I don't think it still has grazing rights today, but it is a very fluid space, whereas a public park often has, spaces for walking, spaces for flower beds, cafes, ponds, you name it, but it's not a free open space. It's quite prescribed. And I think the commons, or a common, has certain challenges in ordinary times. A real common needs to be co-managed by the local community, which brings a certain amount of citizen responsibility. We don't really have that with most commons and parks today because they're run by councils. But I mean, there's a whole conversation to be had about how we can create more common public spaces, and they have happened in Athens during the crisis. I mean, during the financial crisis in Athens, and indeed in Madrid as well. There were squares and gardens in both those cities being managed by citizens in a very interesting way.
I remember
just to add to something that Edwin said, I think one thing that we're quite interested in the differentiation between the common and the park is also the removal of the railings or the barriers around the green space, because we found that a lot of these enclosed spaces, especially in light of the current crisis, create pinch points. So actually that's why a lot of parks aren't usable during this kind of COVID-19 situation, because they actually create crowds where you shouldn't, and they kind of common allows for people to move freely outdoors, even at a time of social distancing. So I think one of the things that we've been thinking about Unscene is how do we remove these kind of barriers in the city, both physical as well as some more intangible ones that maybe prevent everyone from being able to access public space.
Yeah, and part of our research, we found that in World War II, a lot of the barriers and the railings around garden squares, for example, were removed to be melted down for ammunition. Yeah. And in fact, when they were melted down, the quality of the iron wasn't good enough, so it was never used as ammunition. But what it did do was it opened up a load of these squares throughout the city, which anyone could suddenly use. And there's a lot of sort of writing and literature from the time sort of talking really positively about having these spaces in the city that people from all walks of life can come together and use in different ways. And then after the war, a lot of the railings were sort of reinstated by English Heritage. But just like the fact that you can start to test new ideas, and we're really interested in what happens if you, like, it's so simple to remove the railings from a literal kind of perspective, but there are so many obstacles in the way preventing us from doing these things.
It's a very, I mean, the park is a very Victorian notion, isn't it, that you would have a public park and that it is for the public good. It's for the kind of deserving poor and the middle classes, and it is it kind of has a very defined use. Architecture, I think, tends and urbanism tends towards a kind of nervousness about unprogrammed space. You know, there was a lot of talk about the land, the kind of the lawns around social housing, council estates and tower blocks and so on, that you know was unprogrammed and so on. But actually, you know, now we find, I think, that there is an upside to not programming, that it allows itself an adaptation, and in a crisis like this, it's become almost the most useful space. Yeah. Is there a danger that architects are too nervous of allowing something to just develop in its own way?
Yeah, it's interesting how the street has sort of really become the most important place, but to be used in a way that it's not necessarily programmed to be, and how the street was sort of the original playground, but before the car came along. I think something else that's really interesting that's coming out of this conversation of parks being forced to close is firstly, on the flip side, that they have actually had to open back up because of sort of the power of the local voices sort of saying, you know, which I think is really great that people are being listened to. But also that it's extended into a conversation of, like, should cricket grounds be being opened up? Should schools with huge grounds be being opened up? You know, are there other areas of a city that could actually be opened up for people to use?
Golf courses is the big one, isn't it? Well, I always have a feeling there's a kind of element of, I can't stand golf myself, but I always have a feeling there's an element of class war in that definition. And Cristobal, you know, Madeleine was talking there about the street being the kind of the fundamental public space of the city, and your project, your most recent project, I think, was about the documenting of some of the protests in Chile and the way that building owners had responded to the threat in a kind of slightly eerie, sinister manner. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, here in Chile, the pandemic kind of got us in the middle of something else. We weren't in a quote unquote normal situation anyway. So what I did is that, well, last October we big social upheaval started, and we had a few riots going. So in some part of town, buildings started to sort of to prepare for the rights to come, and all these boards, metal or wooden boards, started to appear in the facades, mainly on the ground floor level of the building. So, and the riots never got there, as it were. So they just became a really kind of didactic symbol of what was going on, of how the private was reacting to the social kind of reality. And so that's why here as well, we are contextualizing this conversation in a bit broader sense, in that what we, as you probably know, Chile became a kind of experiment of the N word, the neoliberal project. So everything to do with the public and the private is very sensitive for us. I think for everyone these days. So when we talk about public space, I think we still can. It's hard to define clearly what we're talking about, as we discussed briefly yesterday, because sometimes we maybe what we're referring to is like an open space that everyone can get access to. That would be the. But then the problem is when who not only who owns this piece of land, but what the purpose of it is. And so, for instance, yesterday when we were talking, the concept of a privatized public space came out, which is in itself quite confusing as a concept, because a privatized public space is private space, basically, regardless of whether you can get access and so, or whether the space kind of performs as it was a public space. So that's why for us, we're sort of thinking more about, in the broader sense, whether what is public, what is private, how they relate to each other, because that applies to health here, that applies to education, that applies to everything. So and I think that applies to like what's happening in the UK with the NHS is a clear, and that's public, and it's. So maybe that's what concerns us more a little bit here.
There's a Dutch architect called Wim Calvers, who wrote a short essay on public space, and one of the lines, it's just a series of bullet points really. One of the lines was, public space is the opposite of private space. But you, I think, Manijeh and Madeleine, you slightly disagree with that. You think there are kind of tonal variations, there are grays.
Yeah, I think we got interested in the topic because it's always so polarized between this binary of the public good and the private being bad. And there's this kind of nostalgia for a time when the state kind of funded a lot of public space, which I guess with the exception of this current crisis where the state is kind of intervening, that doesn't seem to be the case, and it's not how governments all around the world are being put into power. So we kind of need to leave that behind and develop new models of kind of understand public and private as not oppositional entities, but actually hybrid models of ownership. I think while it is true that privatized public space is privately owned, a lot of the time it opens up land that was never accessible to the public to be accessible to the public for the first time. But then there isn't a lot of legislation around what people can do on those spaces to make it actually public. And so one thing that we're looking into is how can we change the way people access, use, and manage those spaces? And the GLA very recently launched the Public London Charter, which kind of for the first time starts to regulate privatized public space, but it only focuses on new developments, whereas some of our research is kind of interested in these historic typologies of the high street pub, the kind of areas for teenagers to play, etc., that maybe don't fall within this kind of generic paved square that you often find in a new development. But we do believe it's a kind of gray area for people, for architects and different stakeholders to intervene.
Cristobal?
But yeah, sorry to interrupt. But that's why maybe we need a new concept, as it were, because and it doesn't have to do with private against public, or public against private, or that the private, or everything that's private is bad, or anything like that. It's just there are different conditions. They could be very similar. They could interact. They could be work quite well with each other. But what is private is private. That doesn't mean that it's a bad thing per se. So and also you have a hybrid in kind of in between, which is those private spaces that operate or appear to be public, which is again a third condition, as it were. So my point is not to say anything that's private is bad, or nothing like that. It's just that I think that maybe we need to talk about it with, I don't know, with a different concept, and to make the distinction when something is private, when something is public, when there is this hybrid, like a collaboration, and because those distinctions I think matter, and it not for sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but is a meaningful distinction, and that applies not only to, as I said before, not only to spaces, not only to architecture, but to all sorts of, I mean, to any main activity in our lives.
I thought one of the most interesting manifestations of this difference, which surprised me, was the last kind of major worldwide appropriation of public space for protesters, was the Occupy protests after the financial crisis, and pretty much all the spaces that were occupied ended up being the private spaces, which really surprised me. In the States, in New York, it was the Zuccotti Park, which is a privately owned public space. In London, it was St. Paul's churchyard, because the protesters tried to set up outside the stock exchange and found that was the Pops as well. That was a privately owned thing. They weren't allowed to set up there. And in Hong Kong, it was beneath the Foster's HSBC building. It's kind of the kind of absolutely at the heart of the establishment, and HSBC, for whatever reasons, PR or whatever it might be, decided to let them stay in the shelter there. And it was kind of curious that it wasn't in the Arab Spring. There was a very different phenomenon. It was public space, but in the kind of global north, it was a very curious situation. You see that it's only in situations like that, perhaps, when you begin to see how extensive the web of privatized public space actually is.
Yeah, I think what it really starts to highlight as well is perhaps what Cristobal's trying to talk about, is the lack of transparency over who owns these spaces. And you almost don't realize until you're breaking the rules often that someone else is in charge. So with the Occupy London protests, when everyone sat up on Paternoster Square, it was only then that they realized, only then it became clear to like the wider public almost that was actually private land, and that was how they were thrown off. And it really highlights the importance of having spaces which you can protest on. The importance of, like, if we have a lot of privately owned land, the importance of it being regulated in a way that it does allow for different activities to happen, for people to access and use it in ways that they want to.
Can I ask the two photographers, Will and Cristobal, how, when you're photographing in the city, do you often encounter problems of people trying to move you on when you suddenly realize you're in private space that you hadn't realized?
You certainly do in London, which is probably why I'm not doing much non-commission work in London these days, especially as I've sort of shifted to working with a 5/4, which is just, I can't be quick with that. But yeah, I didn't realize the extent of private land in London until I started wandering around with a camera and a tripod. And it's amazing how quickly, you don't see a security guard, but obviously there's cameras everywhere. In seconds, if not minutes of setting up, someone in high vis has come out to tell you to move on. But I mean, yeah, they tolerate some behaviors, but not all, do they? And there's a certain type of person or activity that they want, and I think photography is more and more seen as something that people don't want, even if it's completely I'm not trying to record anything negative or anything like that. So I think it's frustrating, but I think there's other people, maybe more street photographer style, who are better at showing these places and spaces, and and what happens there.
Yeah. How about you, Cristobal?
I was just going to come out. I mean, I was thinking to give that as an example because it happens a lot that when you photograph in the city and you get guards coming and saying, "Excuse me, you can't shoot this building. You're not allowed to." And I just say, "Well, I'm standing on the pavement. I can do whatever I like." And they get all funny, and then they say, "Okay, but please, wherever." So that happens a lot, and that's a clear example of the. But if I go to a private space, which there are many in Santiago, which kind of behave as a public, then I know that I'm going to lose the argument. If the guards come, I'm just going to lose the argument, and I need to get permission in advance, etc., etc. But also, just not to romanticize public space. In many places, the public space is the one that you are you're being controlled. And the private space is where you can kind of have free speech and do what you want. So it's my point is not to romanticize public space because it can be as oppressive as a private space. I'm sure if you go to more sort of totalitarian regimes, the public space is not a safe space to do what you want to do.
This idea, this notion of the safe space has become a real bugbear of mine recently, and of course the problem with real public space is that it needs to be unpredictable. It shouldn't be programmed. It shouldn't, and it comes with its own issues, whether they're issues of dirt or they're issues of crime, and quite often the measures that make public space acceptable to architects and developers and sociologists are the conditions that marginalize existing communities, immigrant communities, the homeless, and the kind of whatever it might be, minority interests, and they're the kind of harbingers of gentrification. And I wonder whether sometimes we, as you say, Cristobal, whether we do romanticize public space, and actually there needs to be a kind of level of tolerance and unease almost for a public space to be really successful. I can't help thinking of Soho or Times Square, spaces that were once gritty, exciting, absolutely urban, but also sketchy, shady, you can call it, a bit dangerous, and have now been destroyed and are now, not really the places you want to be, ironically.
Yeah,
maybe that wasn't sorry.
The problem with sort of what everyone thinks of when you think of pops, like these very clinical kind of spaces that, like you were saying earlier, people can't really sort of inhabit in any way other than you're told to. And I think, the most exciting parts of a city are often the parts of a city which have been taken over in ways you never would have expected, like the skateboarders under the South Bank, or, they're parts of a city which people have claimed in their own way. And perhaps that's what's often missing.
Yeah, and perhaps instead of architects and developers being these kinds of agents for gentrification, we need to be facilitating a conversation with the people who would actually use the space about, rather than kind of telling them what to do, maybe suggesting some activities, but also learning from how they actually appropriate and use the space. So that's something we're really trying to explore in our exhibition in Venice, is that rather than kind of being really didactic, we actually want to use it as a way to test how people inhabit the space, to uncover what are the activities that they might want to bring to privatized public space.
And I think also we had to remember that public space is a lot broader than I think what we're talking about, because usually we end up always talking about leisure space, open leisure space, but a bus stop is a public space. The pedestrian sidewalks, but most of the public space is already programmed and it has purpose, and it's what allows us to function in the city. Is how you get to from A to B. Is where you wait for someone. Is where somehow we always end up thinking about like this as you mentioned earlier, like this Italian square with people having coffee and kind of having this urban sophisticated life, and public space is just a lot more mundane than I think than what we're talking about.
Yeah, actually, Will, your series on Seaside Shelters, and it was published in a book recently, was very much that kind of, in a way, architecture of the banal, but it was a Victorian kind of infrastructure that is incredibly useful because it doesn't prescribe who can use it. It's open all the time. It's unguarded. I was thinking recently about Seaside Shelters that they might be, which for an international audience are these kind of pavilions by the sea for British people to sit on benches. Yeah, buy your book. Yeah. But they basically protect you from the wind and the rain. That's all they are. So you can still enjoy the seaside when the
well,
weather's
I guess it's that kind of, they're there to offer respite, aren't they? Which you could say, is a kind of fundamental thing behind most public spaces, whether or not, it's a park offering respite from being inside, being surrounded by buildings, or a pub offering respite from loneliness, soberness. And I think that it's the respite issue right now is what I think of when we're talking about what we're missing. But that's really the hard one. How are we going to get past that? At the moment, you want respite from relentlessly negative news cycle and worries about your health when you come into contact with strangers, and that goes hand in hand with being out in a public space, doesn't it? So
I was going to ask, that Madeleine, you touched, I think, for a moment on the idea of the museum, and I was going to ask you, Justin, about the museum as public space. And now the museums are all shut, we're kind of feeling the lack. And I know the Design Museum is not one of the kind of the state museums, but nevertheless, it has this big public space in front of it. It is your lobby is a public space, and you have these kind of layers of publicness in the museum. To what extent do you understand the museum? I mean, specifically the Design Museum, but the museum as a typology as well as public space.
Well, obviously, every museum will differ depending on whether it's state-owned or a private charity, but in essence, they are public spaces, right? And of course, there will be rules that apply much like they do in pseudo-public spaces, where probably if you're going to start skateboarding in the middle of the atrium, you'll get stopped. But by and large, people know what museums are for, and they know what to do there, and they should make people feel welcome. They should be thoroughly inclusive spaces that allow anybody to come in and feel that they can partake. And that's that's my idea of a true public space. But I think what's interesting about the impact of this virus on museums as they start to reopen, whenever they do, is that there will be nervousness around the use of space and the closeness of people, and museums will have to get used to not having as many people in them for a while, and they'll have to probably introduce timed entry, social distancing. Some may insist on masks being worn. Certainly there'll be hand sanitizer everywhere. And these are quite different conditions to the ones we're used to. And it's interesting now that museums get lumped in the same kind of category as sports stadia in terms of having to be the last to be reopened, because, I suppose one thinks of the museum as this kind of edifying place, possibly a temple of culture. I mean, these are, slightly hackneyed ideas, but in recent years, they've become real, temples of popular culture and really popular places. And the idea that government thinks of them as places of the blockbuster, places where galleries are really crowded, and we've all been there. And not all museums are like that, of course, but there is this sense that museums are the spectacle now, and they're popular entertainment, and you get crowds, and that's not what we want. And museums will have to get used to not having that for a while.
That's interesting. So maybe museums go back to being something more exclusive by accident.
Well, not necessarily socially exclusive, but exclusive in terms of the amount of people in a space at once.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Are you finding that perhaps you've got like other ideas now that we're being forced to do everything digitally, and sort of rethinking the way you display some of your exhibitions and stuff, to like perhaps it can also become more inclusive to a wider audience? Is that sort of like a flip?
I think it's definitely true. Yeah, I think that, you know, every museum at the moment is experimenting with online platforms and social media, and that is itself the public realm, isn't it? That's another kind of public realm, and I definitely think it will have an impact on some of the content that museums display, which may start to go online, and certainly forms of learning engagement can happen more easily online now that we're all used to it. But I also think there's a real appetite for real spaces, real objects in space. And I think that a certain digital fatigue is going to set in soon, where we might not want to be glued to a screen all day long, even if we are consuming huge amounts of edifying content. I think people really crave going back to museums, and it's a pity that we'll have to stagger them as they come back.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's very true. That mixture of the artifact and the public, the those two things together, which in a way is the city is one of those as well, where there are the buildings and there are the crowds. That particular mix is, I think, what we're it's certainly what I'm missing, because you can still communicate with your friends in a way, but the physical contact with the city I miss, especially kind of stuck out here in the suburbs.
I think it's the accidental as well. Oh, sorry.
No.
Like I think part of it's the accidental. Like at the moment, everything is very kind of you go to a meeting, you go to a lecture, like it's these accidental interactions of just like bumping into someone or seeing something you wouldn't expect. And that's often like a great thing about going to a museum. Like you don't know what to expect, and when you're there you sort of expand your mind and grow ideas in ways you never would have imagined. And it somehow feels more constrained right now on the platforms we're using, but whether that's something we can somehow challenge in other ways.
There's also, I think, a loss of tactility or three-dimensionality right now, because everything is kind of flattened into the 2D kind of plane of the screen.
Yeah.
Even like the more three-dimensional experiences you have on screen, like they don't capture like how something feels. And I think there's a sense of like the objecthood of something when you go to a museum, and the kind of immersive qualities of space that as architects, like we feel are really missing from our current reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
but I think that's the whole online world is it's going to be, you can talk about it in the same terms, like whether it's private or whether it's a public forum. Before you used to go to the square and shout out what you wanted to say. Now you do it through Twitter, and you feel that you are in an open public forum, and you're not. So I think the same conversation that you can have for the physical actual world, you can have for the obviously for the online world, and so that's going to be really interesting as well.
I think that there has to be a lot more transparency in terms of how we understand not only who owns types of land, but also who owns data. Part of some of our research that we've been looking into is through like facial recognition technology, and the technology itself maybe isn't bad. There's examples of where it's been used to locate lost children in India, and it's just the application of it in private estates in surveillance is bad. And it's bad because we don't know who owns the data and who controls it. And there's a whole argument in the digital sphere as well about like who owns the internet and what does it mean when we use platforms like Zoom. And I think all of these questions kind of start to blur the boundaries between the digital and the physical in terms of private and public.
Well, I'm guessing all of this is going to be archived forever. So every conversation we have now online is there forever and goes towards the kind of creation of this vast Oz-like AI, doesn't it? It all kind of fit. And there is part of the attraction of the public realm is this idea that you have a certain amount of freedom and that you can wander through it without too many consequences, but that's kind of far gone. I wondered, Cristobal, about Chile, when this is lifted, when these current conditions are lifted, what happens then? The protest has kind of run out of steam. And there's a very interesting question. I'm just going to finish the question, because we're all kind of thinking of these post-apocalyptic movies when we see pictures of the streets, the 28 Days Later and the War of the Worlds and the empty streets. But actually, the conditions that you're documenting are kind of pre-apocalyptic. They're kind of expecting something to happen, expecting the crisis, which is it's a rather different condition. I just wonder what the city feels like now.
It feels very, very weird, because just before the pandemic, we were in the middle of something we felt massive. And it's strange, because we thought this is as big as it gets. I mean, something really special is going to happen now, for good or bad. And then suddenly something bigger came out of the blue, and everyone had to go. Everyone had to go home. So it was a massive anticlimax, and obviously the government they're really enjoying this pandemic in a very perversive way, because now they're back in control. They lost control in October completely. It was very symbolic that the people went to this main square, they stayed there, and they said, we're not moving, we're not going anywhere. And the government tried for 3 months to get it back, and they couldn't. And now with the pandemic, they could. There was this, as an anecdote, the Piñera, the president, on his way home, kind of drove by the square. We used to be full of people protesting against him, and he because he was empty, he came out of the car, he went into the square, he took some selfies. So it was a real kind of for everyone. So we don't know what's going to happen. It's impossible to say. People, the government's trying to get back to normal soon, because but what normal is, everyone's discussing what normal is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I have this curious feeling that a lot of governments are kind of almost relieved about the crisis, because it absolves them of all their disastrous economic decisions. Now everyone can just blame the crisis, whether it's Brexit or Trump or whatever it may be. And there's a curious sense of actually the politicians, in a way, it's a kind of manna in some way from heaven.
Do you think that also extends to the tech companies? Facebook, Twitter. There was a bit of a growing backlash against them, wasn't there? And now we're also reliant on them to stay in touch and feel connected. So maybe it's quite opportune for them as well.
Yeah. And also, how much of our like personal liberties are we going to give up in order to come out of this state of lockdown? There's also a lot of talk right now about governments using kind of biosurveillance to check our temperatures, to check our immunity in order to like kind of release us back into the public realm. And it just feels like there's a moment where we could in order to get back to a sense of what's normal, we might compromise how much of our data and our kind of personal freedoms we give up in the process. Certainly.
Well, I mean, one of the kind of predictions is this app, isn't it? This health tracker app that we will all have in kind of in tribute to the Chinese success. And it's a very sinister notion that, we were talking earlier about freedom in the city and moving around the city. If everything you do is documented and followed, it very much changes your relationship to public space. It takes away the drift. It takes away the ability to just be in the city without being surveyed.
Paradoxically, we were kind of okay when that happened in the private realm, because, as we know, I don't know it happens to you, but the other day, before the pandemic, I took a picture of a place where my brother went to study. I sent it to him through WhatsApp and said, "Look, I'm here." And 5 minutes later, I got in Instagram an ad offering me to do a master's there. So that was already happening, and we were kind of okay-ish with it. But now that the state is behaving like the private sector, in that sense, we're getting all kind of worried about it.
Yeah. Well, I wonder actually if we trust, if we trust the tech companies almost more than the state, because the state has been so notoriously hopeless with technology that that you hear these stories about leakage, and the public statistics and home addresses being leaked out into the into cyberspace. You worry that your government is kind of completely incompetent with tech. But what I wonder, in the same way that I asked about the potential learnings, for want of a better expression, from this crisis in terms of public space, I wonder about the cyber aspect as well. The way this has changed the way we communicate. Whether you think that will be lasting, whether we will be traveling to meetings, whether the way we work might change as well. Because it's been broadly kind of successful, hasn't it? It hasn't been that much of a stretch.
Well, I think it might change the way that we design the places we live in as well, because I think what's really come out of it is a lot of people don't actually have adequate places to work from at home. It's not adequate to work from your bed. And that's the reality for a lot of people. And I think it's something we've been ignoring all too much, actually. And hopefully it will help to bring an emphasis onto that and how all these things are interlinked. But I thought it was really interesting what Cristobal was saying earlier, actually, about the protests sort of having to stop, and how that hasn't, well, from what you're saying, it sounds like it hasn't sort of transformed digitally, and perhaps the importance of having physical space to protest, and how digital protest sort of just doesn't seem to work in the same way, because perhaps it's about really needing that people to see people in their physical space.
Yeah, I think what the social media is very active still. We are all kind of on Twitter 24/7, and that hasn't changed. But what you can't do on social media is to take over a space, which you can in a actual physical space. There is no way of, I mean, maybe there is technically, but there is no way of taking over Twitter, as it were. But you can actually go and take over the main square of the city. So that's why you need both.
I remember talking to an Egyptian architect during the Arab Spring, and she was saying that one of the most remarkable things in Cairo during the protests was that the main square, which had tens of thousands of protesters camped out in it, had a lost and found office. And it was the first lost and found office in Egyptian history, or at least in modern Egyptian history. And it was the kind of beginnings of a municipal infrastructure that had never existed, because people didn't expect, once they'd lost something, they didn't expect to get it back. And the expectations began to change.
I think that's interesting, Eddie, because I think what you're describing there is a commons. And I think that, a lot of the conversation has been about the dichotomy or the dialectic between the public and the private. And there is another way, which is the common, and it somehow avoids some of those polarities, because a common is not publicly owned or privately owned, it's commonly owned. I'm not talking about a patch of grass here, I'm talking about any common.
The commons, yeah.
Whether it's water, electricity, air, grass, or public space, the idea that they can be commonly held and commonly managed is the way of getting around this dichotomy between who owns the land and who's in charge, because everybody is. But the challenge of it and the romance of it, in a way, is that it comes with a lot of personal responsibility. And we all have to, and it chimes a bit with what Cristobal was saying about inhabiting a public space with your body. It's a much bigger personal commitment than clicking on a phone. And the commons requires that personal commitment, because we all have to play our role. We all have to respect everybody else's role and everybody else's rights. And it's a real, I mean, it's a real negotiation, and especially the bigger that community gets, it's a real negotiation. But it's such an interesting model for how to run things. I mean, it doesn't work for everything, but for public space, I mean, it's not like we're all going to start paving our pavements ourselves, but there are places where they do that, and it's just interesting that one can rethink the whole model.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are places in London where just local people have started to put like cones out to try and cordon off stretches of the road to become places that kids can play and stuff. And yeah, like you're saying, perhaps it is an opportunity actually for this certain amount of sort of civic pride to come out, and for people to start to really sort of take more ownership of their city and start to come together and test ideas.
I think perhaps in this country and in the States, so much of where we live is kind of dormitory world, that maybe people haven't been as engaged in where they live because they haven't been there much. They traveled somewhere else to the mall or to work or to travel, and now we're forced to be in our neighborhoods, and suddenly you realize you can barricade the street. What is the worst that can happen? Someone tells you to remove the barricades, and it's quite, there are quite radical possibilities.
Yeah, and I guess to go back to your original question about what opportunities can come out of this crisis, the fact that people are spending more time in their local neighborhoods means that they're starting to realize the value of some of the places that they had overlooked before. But there are also new forms of community emerging, whereas people didn't speak to their neighbors or didn't understand like the resources they had in their area, which are now being activated. And I think there's I think the sense of localism that's happening globally is kind of has a collective power in terms of what will change when we come out of this.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, I am going to turn back. I'm hoping that Luke and Francisco are still listening in, because apparently there might have been messages coming in. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask them if we had any.
Sorry, I was supposed to be feeding them in over the internal chat we have. There's been so many, and kind of trying to get these big concepts and all these big discussions into a digestible sentence. I haven't quite done in time, but yeah, I'll put forward a few of the questions. So we've had a lot of engagements. Thanks to everyone that's in the comments. I think it's a good point raised by Chloe Hudson of how public spaces, especially now when we have in London and other, quite crowded cities, have a lot of people are renting, really small apartments. The rise of a studio apartment, and they don't actually have a kind of living room space. I mean, we talk of parks often as gardens, but they won't have a living room. They have kind of one room for, sleep, eat, work, everything. But parks are kind of an extension of that. They are a living room for a lot of people. I see a lot of nodding. What do you all think of that idea?
We've always seen the pub as the kind of living room for the city. So I think it's that when we first became interested in researching that's how we saw it, because I think parks, yes, can be a stand-in for our gardens, but the weather isn't always amazing here in the UK. And I think you do need interior public spaces as well. And I think, like Justin said earlier about the museum, the cafe, there's lots of these kind of interior spaces that are important, especially in cities which are really dense and are kind of cutting out any kind of collective space in the domestic environment. So where do we gather in the city is something that's quite interesting. But then pubs maybe need to move away from just being about drinking and start to incorporate other activities that could better serve a local community in order to serve as this kind of living room for the city.
The pub is a very interesting example because it's the public house. So it kind of sounds like a public building, and it's publicly licensed, clearly. And as I understand it, they arose in response precisely to the demand of a lack of living space in the kind of urban working classes. So the upper classes had their city clubs and their country houses and their big gardens, and the working classes had the pub.
Which actually began as people opening up their living rooms to the public, so to serve drinks, bring people together in their living rooms. So it was a kind of like making the living room more collective. Right.
That's a very interesting, different definition of public space. It moves the conversation on quite a lot, doesn't it? How about any? Well, actually, the question was about parks, wasn't it?
Actually, I think because we're a little bit short of time, because we've got loads on today. We're back on at 3 p.m. I want to kind of move on to the next little point we had. So of course we've got a lot of photographers in the audience that are watching with us, and I think a really interesting point came up. So we had Omer was talking about how everyone's allowed to take pictures of their mobile phones, but as professionals, I think there's something we relate to of when we get our tripod and our professional gear, people are going to be on our case, and it's kind of that, if you like, double standard a lot of the time. But another really interesting point is people talking about the use of imagery in the perception of buildings, which I think is particularly prevalent right now when we can't, we talked about this throughout the programme, we can't visit buildings. So imagery has a new value, and the way that landowners and other interested parties try and control that. So for example, they brought up the example of a vessel, which is, the developers have kind of made a copyright claim for all the photos that are taken of it. I mean, you even have, this goes back beyond kind of the Instagram era. If you look at, the way that buildings name themselves, so, Verghese and so on, and now you have every new skyscraper that's kind of, because a lot of them could get quite unflattering names if you're, saying what they look like. They're trying to control that. So, you have like the Vase, one Blackfriars, but I've never heard anyone call it the Vase. I think there's this whole perception management from landowners. So what do you think about that, and how that affects imagery, and how that's going to be changing moving forward?
I'll leave that to the photographers.
Cristobal.
Maybe to you, mate.
Yeah, I think it's, I wonder how much of a difference there is between Santiago and London, and whether, London's a bit more oppressive, or maybe it's not. I've never visited Santiago. Have you shot much in London?
I did a little bit back when I was living there, but going back to October for us, we realized that the public space wasn't very open, and it wasn't very free. So that's why I think Justin made a really interesting point, how you go from this dichotomy between public and private, and you find a way of mixing those, not in the kind of third way Blair type of bullshit, but in a more kind of sophisticated way. But it has to be transparent. It has to be, people need to know where they are, what their rights are, and I think that's going to become really important, because as I mentioned before, like the States were already, I think London is the city with most cameras on the street in the world, I think, right?
After Chinese cities.
So that's why it's not, it can be as oppressive as the private space, and maybe you feel you're safer in the pub because no one's looking at you, or maybe they are, I don't know. But
just to address that question, it seems to me that the architecture has always been consumed through images more than the building. A new house is always going to be propagated, via the media, and that's more important now than ever. So you can see why developers and architects are more eager to be in control of the image, because the image is increasingly everything.
I think my professional advice would be put on a high vis and hide in plain sight.
Pretend you're a surveyor.
Exactly. But yeah, no, it's a good point, and I think as a photographer, it's maybe an architectural photographer specifically, it's slightly frustrating that Instagram's influence and power, and maybe our role as the most important people to create this imagery is diminishing slightly.
Okay, I'm gonna chime back in, just because we want to get through a few questions and we really don't have that much time for our next talk. But another, I think, quite important point was raised by Tara, and so hi for, thanks for tuning in again throughout the week. Seen you a lot about kind of, he says as a non-white photographer carrying a backpack, he often gets a lot of negative attention from security, and I think he's kind of raised the point of this inequality in the access to document spaces, and how do you think that's something that we can overcome?
I think that's a really good point, because one of the things we've been looking at in our research is the barriers to enter different types of privatized public space, whether they're physical barriers like gates and railings like we talked about earlier, or these more intangible barriers that kind of prevent people from different backgrounds or different parts of the city from entering based on how they look or the kind of connotations people have about them. I mean, we talked about facial recognition earlier, and that's also prejudicial based on like kind of how you look. And it tends to skew towards only being able to track kind of white men, and I think with Apple there was lots of controversy about it not being able to distinguish between people of other races. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to change, like to really unpack what does access mean, and how we can actually make a city that's being able to be inhabited by everyone, and that there shouldn't be like a different way of treating an architectural photographer based on their skin color. I don't have an answer for it. I think it's just more framing the problem.
Well, I think that's more. It's more. I guess, but it's more of a social, political, and so on answer we're looking for, isn't it? And there's, again, we come across this all the time within our fields. Architects, photographers, whatever. A lot of the things that we want to kind of change in the way our world works are much bigger than what we do. And I think it's, I guess this festival as well as the example of, I think we can all achieve bigger and better things when we're coming together across different fields. And that's really important. And I think Francisco, you had one more question before we leave it.
That was a really, really good talk. I really enjoyed the discussion. I have a question about that. It was briefly discussed anyway, but around control and how we tend to not like control in public spaces, but all of a sudden in a pandemic or in a social uprising, people are asking for control. And then how do you see, maybe it's a very wide question, but are we getting the freedom in public spaces back? And how is that control going to work in the future after this pandemic or after the social uprising in Chile? It was an open question.
I think it is a very interesting question, because people, immediately, you see that Trump and Boris Johnson's popularity, despite the incredible mishandling of the pandemic, has shot up. So there is this kind of bizarre sadomasochistic yearning for control in a crisis. People want their leaders to be, they want to admire their leaders, and they want them to be doing it right. My hope is that will dissipate as soon as the crisis is over. But my fear is that the crisis gives them the tools to erode freedom, and that once those erosions take place, they're very difficult to get back again.
Okay, great. Well, I think that I guess we could talk about this forever. And thank you all for your contributions. It's been great to hear kind of from such a range of people. Fantastic experiences and viewpoints. We just have, we have such a rush schedule today. We've got so much to get through. So just before we leave, again, thanks to everyone that's taken part, and thanks to everyone taking part at home as well on the YouTube comments. I'd like to direct you to our website, zoomedinfestival.com, where you can see the rest of our program for the day. So we're back at 3 p.m. UK time. We've got a really exciting talk with, one of the kind of leading photographers in the field of architecture right now, which I'm really excited for. And also, of course, our charity print sale in aid of the Trussell Trust. So we're doing an affordable print sale. So we got some of, the most reputable architectural photographers in the world are taking part in this, making the prints available for absolutely dirt cheap. And we've been supported by our print partner, the Image Print Centre, on this as well. And it's a great chance to kind of, get hold of one of these rare images and also support a good cause. And, thank you to everyone who's been supporting so far. I haven't done my maths yet, but I think we're looking at a 4-figure donation. So keep that coming. Please do take a look if you can. And also at Zoomed In Festival on Instagram, at Zoomed In Fest on Twitter. And we'll see you back very soon. Thanks for tuning in, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.